Welcome to Data Feminism, the second lecture in our program, Data and Democracy, speaker series of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. My name is Barbara Mennel, and I'm the Rothman Chair and the Center's Director. Our speaker series, Data and Democracy, is the second installment of a multi-year series on rethinking the public sphere, which responds to challenges to rational public debate. Data and Democracy turns to the question of how new technology algorithms underlying big data shape human experience, communication, and representation. How do race and racism, equity and inequality, and gender shape and are produced by technical systems? If you're interested in attending the upcoming talks in the series, please visit the link posted in the chat. I would also like to thank our generous sponsors, the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, W. Mellon Foundation, and at UF, the following units: the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Chief Diversity Officer of UF, the Informatics Institute, the African American Studies Program, the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and the Center for Latin American Studies. We're also posting in the chat an announcement for a position for a assistant professor at the University of Florida in its Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research for a position in feminist technoscience and related fields, specializing in critical analysis and applications of artificial intelligence and data science. Finally, for those of you who are interested in knowing more about the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere other programs, we invite you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter, also post in the chat. So the very last bit of housekeeping, our guest today, Catherine D'Ignazio, will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers. And please put them at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A box, and I will then convey them to her. Our speaker today, Catherine D'Ignazio, has worked as a freelance software developer and experimental artist. Her projects have won awards Foundation and the Knight Foundation and have been exhibited at the Venice Biennale. She's the director of Data and Feminism Lab and an assistant professor in the Massachusetts Institute for Technology's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She's authored a wonderful book with Lauren F. Klein entitled Data Feminism that provides an accessible overview of the intersection of data science and feminism with special attention to the visualization of data. It is open access and we're posting the link in the chat as well. This book has just been nominated as a finalist for the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers in the category of Computing and Information Sciences. And her talk today is entitled Data Feminism. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to share our screen. Hope that this works. Let me just adjust that a little bit. There we go. So yeah, it's a real honor to be here, and thank you to Barbara, to Sophia, to Alexandra, and to everybody else, all the sponsors. It's very impressive to see that list of sponsors as well. And I just want to say I'm really honored to be part of this series, which is addressing such important topics. So as Barbara said, I'm gonna just jump right into it, and I'm gonna talk a little bit today about the book that Lauren Klein and I just published this past year, well, 2020, last year now, I guess, called Data Feminism. And while I'm here representing the book, Lauren Klein is an equal co-author of the book. She is an associate professor of English and quantitative theory and methods, and she's down at Emory University in Atlanta. And so just does some really phenomenal work in digital humanities using quantitative and also methods of data visualization. And yeah, and you can see the open access version of the book. I mean, you can just Google data feminism and find it, hopefully. And then also at this URL that's here, datafeminism.io is the website for the book. And we have a link there to also go read about it. So there we go. So yeah, I think where we're headed today, I'm going to talk a little bit about our motivation for writing the book, ground us a little bit in which feminism we're talking about, and then show you some of the examples that come out of the book. And then hopefully that'll be a good kind of basis for getting introduced to the work. So Lauren and I see data feminism as part of a growing body of work. So it's not just us that are saying these things. And this body of work is starting to hold corporate and government actors accountable, basically for making racist, classist, and sexist data products. So folks who are here today may be familiar with some of these cases, but these are things that at this point pop up almost every day in the news. So there are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants who went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, and child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, and many more things. And while we were writing this book, we're really drawing from this real surge in work that has come out really in just the past like 5 to 10 years, that you can see some of that here below. Things like algorithms of oppression. Ruha Benjamin, who I noted is coming to your series as well, also a huge inspiration. And these are all folks who are starting to describe the inequalities that we're baking into these data-driven systems. And the fact that these examples keep coming is one of the reasons that we were motivated to write the book. And corporations, so whereas the corporations who keep producing these things, they see data as the new oil. So this is this quote here on the top of the slide is essentially a meme. I don't know how many people have heard of this meme, but this has been in circulation since actually the mid-2000s. I thought it was later than that one, but I went back and like traced it, and it's mid-2000s that it came out. And since that meme sort of got spoken, it got picked up, and then sort of most famously, it got picked up by The Economist magazine in the early 2010s. And then now it's at the point where it's been repeated many times over. You can actually go watch YouTube clips that mash up, basically lots of men in like high profile conferences being like, data is the new oil, data is the new oil, data is the new oil. As you can see, all the different people that have said this. And I think it's like a really interesting meme to sort of pick apart, because on the one hand, data really, they are like oil, right? There's actually a lot of parallel, even just in the metaphors that we use to describe them. So often what we do is we go and we mine for data, we extract data, we clean and process data, and so on and so forth. And then of course, very similar to oil, we take data and process it and turn it around for great profit for a tiny slice of the population. And so in that sense, like the metaphor is actually really apt. I don't think it's exactly what they intended, because I think they mean this in a very good way. Like what they mean by this meme is like, we can make tons of money by using data, but it's actually very, kind of parallels this very extractive industry that led to benefits for few and great harms to many more. But, kind of in response to all of this hype about data and hype about what it might do for us, there's been this growing wave of pushback. And this has come from many different sort of people and worlds, but it's really been led by Black and Indigenous women of color, by white women, by Indigenous people, by immigrant communities, by LGBTQ folks, many more. Again, these are some of the works that we found inspirational here. And the pushback has been saying, boiling down all these arguments, including our own, data is the same old oppression in the sense, like in a sense that there's nothing new that is happening here. It's just that data-driven systems are accelerating and exacerbating the structural inequalities that have been around for like many centuries. And so, yes, and so in a way, what our contribution is to this growing pushback, because what's very exciting to me is to be part of a growing body of work that's approaching this from many different perspectives. But what we bring in particular to this conversation is how feminism and how intersectional feminism in particular has been focused on dismantling oppression and the forces of power that cause inequality for a very long time, and what we can learn from that as we go on to do the work of data science. But then the one, like a slight detour that I wanted to make here is to say that while this work has been led by women of color and Black women in particular, speaking out against this same old oppression carries consequences. I don't know if folks here have heard of this very recent case of Dr. Timnit Gebru. Until recently, she was a research scientist and the co-lead of ethical artificial intelligence team at Google. She's very well known. She's very high profile. She does scholarship on machine vision. She's also very high profile because of her work on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of AI. She was one of the co-founders of the group Black in AI. And so the sort of way that this firing came about is leadership at Google approved a paper that she and her team were working on for many months. Then suddenly they reversed their decision and told her and her team that after working on this paper and getting it approved, actually they needed to retract it from the venue that had accepted it and was about to publish it. And so Dr. Gebru wrote to them and was like, what's going on? I need to know why you made this decision all of a sudden. And she also put in there, I also want answers to all of these things that you haven't moved on internally in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then their next response to her was that she was fired. And so what this prompted then is more than 2,500 Google employees, and at this point, over 4,000 academics and AI researchers have signed a petition. And if folks who are on this call want to sign the petition, it's linked here. HBCU recruiting firms dropped Google as a client, citing moral concerns over their treatment of Black people. And in fact, 9 members of Congress wrote a letter to Google demanding accountability for Dr. Gebru's firing, but there has still been no answer to that. And so this treatment is really shameful, particularly for one of the very few, very high profile Black women in the field of AI. Yet at the same time, my colleagues at MIT, Dr. Caitlin Turner, Dr. Danielle Wood, in conversation, they pointed out like this is not an isolated case. And so I just want to highlight here, the 3 of us have just actually today got released this new forthcoming piece that describes the abuse and misogynoir playbook. Like in fact, what Google did to Timnit Gebru it's a centuries-old playbook that's been used against Black women who speak truth to power. And so I just want to make that case that like these issues are very real, they're very current, and they're playing out right now in this very high-profile way in terms of like sort of who's going to own the future of AI ethics and how much are we going to ethics wash what's happening at corporations. So why does this matter? So like, why does Dr. Gebru's case matter for the field of computer science, for the broader field of data science more generally? And it does come back to feminism. So feminism as both a theory and a practice demands that we ask who questions, meaning data science by whom? Who is doing this work? Data science for whom does the work benefit? Data sets about whom do we capture information? Whom do we surveil? Who are the people in the data sets? And data science with whose values? And so feminism means many things to many people. So when we do these talks, we like to ground people doing some level setting of which definition we are using in the book for feminism. And so we start here, which is from a Beyonce song, which is also from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it turns out. So a feminist is a person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So first of all, we get that feminism is a belief. Secondly, we have a second definition, which is that it's not just a belief, but it's also organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So, if you believe in a world that is equal for all genders and sexes, then you just have to look around and see that that world is not this world yet. And so feminism compels us to take action to realize that world. So feminism is belief, and it's also it implies political action and a commitment to that. And then finally, feminism has a third definition, which is that it's a set of theories and ideas. And I really love this third definition because it means we don't need to do this work alone. So we build on the shoulders of so many amazing people who have come before this, who have faced similar issues, and who have written brilliant things and done brilliant artwork and done brilliant interventions and political actions, and that we can build from and learn from. And so these theories begin by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But the past 40 years of scholarship, and of course our current political reality, have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things. And so that brings us back to this idea of intersectional feminism. I don't know how new or not new that is, but we say in the book that feminism in the year 2020 must be understood as being intersectional. And so, as you may already know, intersectionality is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who's depicted here at the bottom right. And she uses this idea to explain how social inequality cannot be explained only by one dimension of difference, such as gender or sex. So when we talk about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. And so that includes thinking always about racism, about classism, about colonialism, and so on. And the key thing to understand about intersectionality, which is sometimes overlooked when we are only talking about like our own individual identities, is that intersectionality is not just talking about our individual identities, like I'm white and I'm an academic and this kind of thing, but it's also talking about structural forces of power and their intersection. So it's talking about structural forces such as sexism or racism and how those two forces compound to produce a kind of a nonlinear effect. And it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about power. And in the book, we have a short section and also a bunch of footnotes that trace this history back. There are scholars that have traced, of course, intersectionality is Kimberly Crenshaw's concept for sure, but then this way of thinking about these interlocking forces of oppression is a kind of thread that goes back. Folks have traced it back into the 19th century, in fact. And so the key takeaway from intersectional feminism is it's not only about women, and it's not even only about gender, it's about power. It's about thinking about which structural forces of power produce which differential effects. And in today's world, data is power. We see that in that meme from The Economist about data being the new oil. We see that in just this like very material and quantitative way where we see like which companies are on top. These are the companies that are mobilizing large scale big data warehouses and resources. And we also see this in the idea of data as the same old oppression. And so, the main, I guess, underlying takeaway from the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that balance of power be challenged and changed. And in fact, our argument is that data science needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn any of these power imbalances. So as we were writing the book, Lauren and I had discussions with each other. We looked across and reviewed literature out of a wide variety of fields. One of the exciting and sort of overwhelming things about feminism is that you find feminist approaches in a amazing variety of fields. So everything from like law and economics and politics to human computer interaction to information science to geography to many other things. And so, you know, we make no claims to complete literature review. But as we looked across sort of how it's been mobilized in a lot of different fields and how people have as we might say, like operationalized it. So we actually looked in particular at literature coming out of design-based fields, or we found some really interesting papers in demography, actually, sort of how people were thinking of actually kind of like, how do we implement feminism? How do we do feminism in these different fields? We came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data science, including both sort of the doing of data science and also the communication, visualization, like kind of what are the products and outputs of a data science process. And the goal here was to operationalize feminism, to really think about like, how do we apply feminism for data science? It wasn't necessarily to make new feminist theory, is to think about how do we draw an existing theory and apply it in this very specific domain with these specific kinds of problems of inequality that are surfacing. And these are the 7 principles. And this is in fact how the book is structured. So each chapter in the book corresponds to one of these principles. And then what we do is we sort of take you on a tour of feminist thinking about those things. We try to introduce feminism and feminist theories and thinkers to folks who may not be familiar. And then we also show how people in the world of data science writ broadly are actually doing these things already. So we try to show examples of people who are doing this already kind of in action. So I don't have time to go through all the principles today. I'm going to go through a couple of them and talk about some of the examples that come out of them. One thing that maybe I'll just draw your attention to is that the first 2 principles are about power, examine power and challenge power. And that just goes back to this idea that this thinking about power, this analysis of power, and then also this direct kind of political commitment to righting the balance of power. These are the central feminist commitments. So occasionally when we've given talks about the book so far, people have said, well, like, what makes this feminist? Like, why isn't this just good data science? And like, so I'll just say that's the answer to the question. If that question comes up, what makes it feminist is this examination of power and an explicit commitment to challenge unequal balances of power in data science. Okay, so we'll dive into some examples here. So with this idea of examining power, which is what we'll talk about first, we talk about projects like Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. And so this idea of missing data sets is a term that is coined by Onuoha, and she's an artist, by the way, and this is actually an art project. And this idea of missing data sets is a term that describes data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But in fact, these data sets do not exist in real life. So things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. Or for a very salient example from right now, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States. So these are data sets that are missing in the sense that there is no institution that is currently collecting those data. Onuoha exhibits this piece as a GitHub repository, which is the thing that's linked that you can kind of see here on the right. And it's also an art installation. And so in the art installation, you can actually like go up to the piece, you can page through these file folders, and each file folder is labeled with the data that are not collected. And then of course you can take out a folder and open it up, but of course it's empty because the data there are missing. And the reason they're empty is because of this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world. And so this imbalance of power kind of goes back in the pipeline. We talk a lot about biased data sets and biased algorithms. But in fact, there's also a bias, of course, and what we even decide in the first place is worthy of collecting data about. There are many things that go uncollected. Governments, it's also like Mimi's project is also about an observation about who has the funds to mobilize data collection efforts. So governments have this power, elite universities have this power, corporations have this power. In many cases, minoritized groups do not have this power. And so this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power, because too often the data sets that we can access, these have already been affected by the imbalances of power in the world. And another case of missing data sets is the case of feminicide, data about feminicides in Mexico and also basically in every other country in the world. And so in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who resolved to head straight towards the problem and collect the missing data herself. And so this example comes up in the chapter we have on challenging power. So for a little bit of context, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They are legally defined as crimes in actually the majority of Latin American countries, thanks to the Latin American feminist movement. And yet the state does not systematically collect data about the scope and the scale of the problem. So they've said feminicide is bad, we are criminalizing it, but they actually don't know the full scope and scale of it, nor do they take action to actually sort of mitigate its occurrence. They've just sort of made a moral statement of like, it's bad. And so feminicide is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So folks can go look at the hashtag Ni Una Menos because of the way in which the state is neglecting to fully implement its own laws and provisions. And so Maria Salguero is like very frustrated by this situation. Starting in 2015, she started collecting data about feminicide in Mexico by logging cases from news reports. And so she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicides on a Google map that she gets literally by reading these news articles. And in fact, because of her persistence in doing this, she now has the largest public archive of feminicide in the Mexican context. And because of that, she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided her data to journalists and NGOs. And she's even testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And so in the book, we frame this as a form of feminist counter data. So this is an activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this represents one way to use data to challenge power. And of course, it's not the only way. And like there's going to be, we often refer to the idea in the book that data is a double-edged sword, meaning the answer to a social problem is not collect more data, because often data can put vulnerable and marginalized folks at further risk and further harm and make them visible to institutions that want to hurt them. But in cases like this, collecting counter data is a path towards justice. And just real quickly, just to note that like this idea of counter data has a lot of parallels in many other situations. Like I mentioned, COVID is one of those where, in fact, right now in the United States, our most reliable data about COVID are coming from non-institutional sources. So they're coming from the New York Times Case Tracker, the COVID Tracking Project, Data for Black Lives, which has begun a project about releasing race and COVID data at the county level, and so on and so forth. And we still do not have great data about sex and gender and tribal status and affiliation. So this next example talks about this idea of embracing pluralism. And so this comes out of chapter 5. And this in a way has more to do with the process of undertaking a data science project. And so this example is from the San Francisco Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which you can see here. That's who made this map. This is a group that since 2013, they've worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to map the eviction crisis in the Bay Area. So each red dot on the map that you see here indicates a place where a person or a family was evicted. And then the blue dots indicate places where AEMP has also interviewed one of the people who was evicted. And so it's a really interesting, their projects, generally speaking, also a really interesting mix of quantitative and qualitative. So that pulls up these oral histories and testimonies, which you can see here. Phyllis Bowie, who's a Midtown resident, and talks about her experience of getting pushed out of her community. But we contrast that work, which is very kind of grounded and in community, with the work of the Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton University. And so their goal is also to present a picture of eviction, but this time at the national scale. And this is a worthy goal. But this project is wildly different in terms of its process. So whereas the AEMP is working like directly in collaboration with residents and impacted groups, with tenants' rights organizations, and so on, the Eviction Lab's maps derive from seemingly sort of bigger data, and the map seems to present a more comprehensive picture of eviction in the US. The issue here, and these two groups actually got into a kind of tangle, which we describe in the book, is that the Eviction Lab purchases their data from these national real estate databases, which significantly undercount evictions. And in fact, working with local communities, AEMP has gathered messier, but ultimately much more accurate and sort of higher quality and more contextualized data that documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And so in this case, we talk about the AEMP versus the Eviction Lab as a way of embracing pluralism, as a way of getting a deeper and more contextualized idea of the problem at hand. And so what does that mean? It means thinking about how do we integrate a kind of more participatory process for doing data science. But then this also begs the question, like if we're saying like, let's invite more people into the process when we're, say, collecting data, when we're analyzing and cleaning data, when we're deciding what to do with that data, we can't bring everybody's voice to the table, right? That's usually not possible. So whose voices do we prioritize? And feminist design has a really clear answer to this question. So following the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Xiaowen Barzell, a feminist design perspective would take power into account and center the experiences of the people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. And so in a sense, make decisions and design from the outside in. This is very similar, this idea of embracing pluralism and working with folks who are most impacted from a given issue. This is very similar to a principle that is also espoused by the Design Justice Network, who, if you haven't heard of them, they're great to check out. Folks who are really interested in design for social justice. Also a great book called Design Justice, that's worth checking out. And so their principle is we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. And so the same is true for the design of data science projects. So these are the folks who we should be working hard to build relationships with. Okay, I think I just have, a couple more slides. So the previous examples have focused on issues of power and people. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to what theorists call structures of power, and more specifically to binary structures. So feminist theory has helped show us why, as we say in the book, behind a binary, there's always a hierarchy. And so we see this in the idea of like the gender binary, I should say the empirically false idea of the gender binary. So this idea, but that like, there's men and there's women. This is a kind of obvious reference point for what constitutes a false binary. And it's also not only a false binary, but it's also an unequal hierarchy, right? Because men and women, there's actually like, it's like men on top and women are here, right? And in fact, like non-binary people are like completely erased from that model. But so one of the key moves of feminist theorists is whenever we encounter a binary, then we challenge that binary. We say, well, like, what are we erasing? What are we putting in a hierarchical structure that doesn't need to be hierarchicalized, and so on. And so how do we use that critique of the gender binary and apply that to every time we encounter these false binaries in the world? Because often also these false binaries are often sort of gendered. And so this goes for data visualization, because in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught somehow that reason is better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. And so best practices for data visualization often involve clean design, minimalist aesthetic, a kind of a just the facts, very neutral approach, neutral titles. But in the book, we say, well, like, why? Why are these our best practices? And why are they best practices, especially when scientific research has actually shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. Like when we see neutral things, those we still have a like kind of emotional read on that neutrality. This example that we talk about in the book, these large black images that you see are screenshots of an animated visualization. You can find it at guns.periscopic.com. This is the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in 2013. And each person killed by a gun that year is represented by a single arc. And the arcs are traced one by one on the screen. So this unfolds over time since it's animated, and starts very slowly, and it places names on it. And then it gets faster and faster until it creates this kind of like total visualization that you see here. And so it's pretty overwhelming to watch. And it's almost unbearable in a sense. And that is the point. There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States, and it's an epidemic. So methodologically, it's no less sound than any other study. The data about people come from a national crime data set. Their projected lifespans are determined using a statistical model. But this visualization, when it came out, caused a stir in the visualization community because it made us feel. And it has a very explicit framing around guns and gun deaths specifically as stolen years. And so it has this figure on the right where you can see there's over 500,000 stolen years that were stolen from people by gun deaths, basically. And so here, a feminist approach would say that this is not a problem at all. The fact that this made us feel things is not a problem. In fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. So this idea of rebalancing reason and emotion opens up our data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what really matters in a design process, which is honoring context, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge imbalances of power that we encounter. Okay. Final point, and then we can open it up for questions. One of the things we say at the beginning and at the end, but I think it's always worth saying, is that data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data visualization and data science. So the data science that isn't defined by the size of the data set, it's not defined by the credentials of the people doing the work. Like you don't need a PhD to do data science. These kinds of concerns are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. And so in order to like kind of show that expanded definition of data science, we sample many, many different examples of things that we would frame as data science, like the mural that you see here at the bottom of this slide. We would say this is data science. the sculpture in the middle here, we would say this is also data science. It's important that if we're really going to pursue a kind of expanded definition, this is like where the innovation is happening, and in particular around data and justice. The innovation is happening from artists, it's happening from data journalists, it's happening from activists and social movements. These are many of the places that can teach us how to do sort of data for good. And we'll skip that for time. And just one last thing to say is we've just released, if you want a kind of like downloadable, printable thing, we have just released a set of data feminism infographics in multiple languages, which can be a handy, I don't know, printout. At some point we wanted to actually like print them as postcards and hand them out at an exhibition, but that will have to be in a post-COVID world when, you know, a person can touch a thing and then another person can take the thing that was touched. But so in the meantime, you can download these infographics from our website in a variety of languages. So thank you so much. And please do be in touch. Here's all of our contact information. And I really look forward to hearing from folks.